So you've all been very punctual. Thank you very much. We'll get going. My name's Diane Coyle. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Manchester. Great to see that there is such interest in hearing these four very distinguished economists. They're both incredibly well informed about Brexit and in some cases highly opinionated about it as well. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak for up to 10 minutes each, give some introductory remarks. And then it's over to you. We're making you work this evening. We want your comments and questions. Some Brexit audiences can get a bit rough. I'm not expecting that this evening, but we'll keep it polite and calm. And let me introduce the panel. And first of all, we're going to have Swati Dhingra from the London School of Economics, Jagjit Chadha, Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, Michael McMahon from the University of Warwick, and Paul Johnson, who's the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. All people you might have heard on the radio talking about this and other subjects. So with that, over to Swati.
Okay. Can you hear me? Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to not just give you numbers on the fact that, yes, the EU is our biggest trade and investment partner, so anything we do in terms of leaving the European Union is going to have an impact on economic activity in this country. I'm instead going to let you focus in on Sunderland, and I'm going to illustrate what's happening, what will happen after Brexit in that context. So Sunderland's main industry, of course, one of the main key industries is the car industry, with the Nissan plant being there. About 40% of those cars are shipped to the European Union. About 50 times is when the auto components cross the border. So imagine a situation where we do go to a WTO default. So in that case...
I'm going to interrupt you. What is a WTO
default? So the WTO default means instead of having some kind of special deal with the European Union, which we currently do because we're members of the European Union, we would exit the single market, not have any other kind of new trade agreement with the European Union, and instead, as members of the World Trade Organization, we would interact on the same terms that the US, Brazil, China, or India currently interact with the European Union. So that would mean the same car which was shipped from the UK to the EU now is going to have to pay a 10% tariff. Every time it enters the European Union, the car manufacturers will have to prove that in fact that car was made in the UK. Typically that number of how much that increases the value of essentially trading, the cost of trading, is about 8%. So we're talking about 10% tariff plus this 8% of establishing that, yes, the car was made in the UK and it wasn't as though all the parts were made in China and we're just assembling them and sending them over to the European Union. So for most of these, for these kinds of local economies, this is going to have a substantial impact on the competitiveness of the main business activity that happens in that local economy. And going with that then is, of course, the rest of the issue about once we start seeing one industry decline, how are we going to keep the rest of our economy going? So that's really what's at stake. And most of the time, that was something that was not articulated very well in the British press. And the main reason for that was that every time any of us spoke about Brexit, there were 96% of us on one side saying that, yes, Brexit would have a substantial negative economic impact on trade and investment with the European Union. And that's going to translate into lower living standards for the public here. Anytime we said that, we were always balanced, countered by the one lone economist for Brexit who insisted that that was not true, even though they had very little data backing that. So that's really what's at stake. And going forward, if we do see a hard Brexit, that we do go to being just members of the World Trade Organization, not having any kind of special deal with the European Union, immediately exiting and not having anything else in place, those are the sorts of issues that are going to arise, that UK businesses are going to find it much harder to interact with the European Union. That's our biggest trade and investment partner. That won't change overnight, even if we do great trade deals with the US, with China, with India, because most of these countries, in fact, do protect their car industry very much. And there are many, many sectors like those where we still see a lot of protectionism, and which isn't going to we're not going to be able to immediately re-gear our production to those industries, to those countries, and we're not going to be able to get the kinds of great deals that were essentially promised to us. So I'll stop here, and then we can always follow back.
Thanks very much, Swati. Jagjit.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Swati. Okay, so almost for the first time in living memory, economists agreed. And when they'd agreed, so the story goes, they were ignored. Actually, I don't think they were ignored, and I'll give you some reasons why. But let me just remind you why economists thought that leaving the European Union would be damaging to the UK economy, if not in magnitude terms a massive way, at least in a significant way. It's for the reasons Swati just outlined. It's a rich trading area on our doorstep with whom we trade more with than any other part of the world. And into that trading relationship, we're going to throw some sand into the wheel. We're not going to let it move as quickly as it did before. And that's probably going to impact on trade, given a wealth of economic research over the last 25 years. The things that drive trade are proximity and wealth. And the European Union has both of those. So it seemed to most economists who'd done the work that this would lead to less trade, and trade is an important aspect of economic output, and lead to low levels of output. Secondly, most people thought that investment would suffer business investment. So investment comes from businesses. Businesses invest in capital stock when they want to grow. But if they're uncertain about the future, businesses tend to defer investment. They tend to just say, look, I'll wait until the situation clears. When will the situation clear? Well, 9 months after the referendum, we triggered Article 50. That's a 2-year limit, but the most likely scenario is that we're going to end up with a transitional arrangement that may last for another 4 or 5 years, and that's just for the EU. The European Union itself is only negotiating 12 bilateral free trade agreements at the moment. We're going to have to do over 50, probably not within the next 3 or 4 years. So that level of uncertainty is likely as well to add as an ongoing drag on the level of output in the economy. So this is all known. I'm sure it's known to everyone in the room. So we'll take it as something that people understood. I'm not going to say that the people in this country didn't understand. We have a long, mature democracy, despite what some people think. And I think the referendum result was sending us an important signal. And it's up to economists to understand the signal that was being sent. And the signal, I think, was one about dissatisfaction with economic outcomes 25 years into a period of globalization. Now, the European Union was part of globalization, but wasn't all of it. It was all globalization, if anything, is about our relationship with those countries and those bits of economic activity outside of these islands. And the European Union was seen to be part of that process. And if we go a little bit deeper and dig into the reasons for the vote, we can do analysis now of the 623 odd regions, and we can understand which ones voted in more fractions for leave and more fractions for remain. And some consistent messages are returned to us. In general, people who were older tended to vote to leave. People who had higher levels of educational attainment, whatever that means, I don't mean it in any IQ sense or anything like, or in any necessarily measure of intelligence, tended to vote to remain. Areas in which there were recent levels of migration, not more distant levels of migration, also tended to vote leave. So in some sense, the vote, as you begin to look at it, was as much a comment on the lack of economic progress or the prospective economic progress for large sections of the population. Remember or recall, in the last 10 years, income per head has gone sideways in this country. It hasn't increased at all for the first time in our recorded economic history. And so the deeper problems in the economy remain. Vote leave or vote remain. We've got deep-seated structural problems in this country. A lack of investment, whether it's public or private, persistently low levels of productivity. Productivity, we mean, is the amount of widgets one person can produce by working for an hour. Our level of productivity is around 20 to 25% below that, our comparative trading partners' levels. And when we look at things like long-run growth, the UK, since the mid-18th century, has tended to grow in income per head terms of around 1.5%. We haven't grown at all in the last 10 years, and when we try to understand what drives growth, it's very much about investment and very much about productivity, things that we haven't addressed as a country adequately well in the last quarter of a century. And again, I think the vote was telling us more that people are dissatisfied with economic outcomes than necessarily something about the European Union. A final thought, if I may. If the vote to leave the European Union was us cocking a snook at globalization and the rest of the world, remember all of us that the UK is now a relatively small part of the rest of the world, and manufacturing or our interlinks with the rest of the world are going to be important no matter what. At the turn of the 20th century, the UK was around 16% of world GDP. It's now around 2%. If we crank it forward another 25 years, it's going to be 1%. This is the process of specialization and the need for internationalization of our production. That's going to have to remain as part of the ingredient of a successful UK economy inside or outside the European Union. Our biggest problem is to extract ourselves from the European Union and yet keep the necessary agenda alive. That is to improve investment, improve productivity, and improve the lot of people who are going to be an ever smaller part of the world and therefore have to rely on it, not turn our backs from it.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start by saying it's my belief as an economist that the UK economy is not going to collapse as a result of Brexit. But that's my opinion, and I'm an economist, so I'll probably be wrong. Now, me saying that may have made some of you more likely to listen to me, and may have made some of you less likely to listen to me. I don't really mind about that. The thing I worry about a bit more is the fact that my acknowledging that I might be wrong may have made many of you decide not to listen to me. And this, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we face as economists, and it's never been as clear to me as it has been in the last 18 months, and particularly around the decision to leave the European Union. I'll very quickly outline some issues of my vision. It's not that I disagree at all with what both Jagjit and Swati have said. It's just that I think any effects that we see are going to be very gradual, and they're going to be felt over a number of years. And this is going to make it very different to what we saw, say, for example, in 2007, 8, 9 with the financial crisis, where in a matter of years, output in this country, production in this country fell by numbers like 8 and 10%. Instead, the effects that most economists are trying to convey when they say it will cost the UK economy 3%, 4%, 5%, what they mean is that rather than growing as much as, say, 10%, you would only grow by 5%. So it's much harder to see a collapse. It's much harder to feel it. The effects come through things like the raspberries you purchased being 10 pence more this month than they were last month. But you don't necessarily attribute that back to a decision made in 2016. But these are, but it's certainly the case that if you leave with just a WTO deal that Swati was describing, in other words, no special deal, that does not mean no trade. There are many countries that do lots of trade with the UK and don't have a special deal. But the difficult question to ask is, if costs of trading go up by 5 or 10 or 15%, do UK companies have the margins built in to be able to absorb that? Do they have enough profit to say, we can take that hit without putting up prices or without losing competitiveness? And that's where we will see the effects. But again, it's a hard story to tell. The other cost which I do see are the fiscal costs, the government costs. The difficulty of this divorce cannot be understated. It is not just splitting who gets to keep the records and who takes the DVD collection. This is economies and legal systems and regulatory frameworks that have become totally intertwined. It's those of you who have headphones with your mobile phone. There's something magical about them. No matter what you do, if you put them in your bag or in your pocket, no matter how nicely you've wrapped them up, as soon as you go to retrieve them, they're knotted. That's been happening for 30, 40 years between the EU and the UK. And now we're trying to unwind those wires to get the headphones back on. I'm sure we'll do it, but the cost to government and the amount of civil service time that has to go into that is time that they will not be thinking about the challenges of productivity, the challenges in the NHS, the challenges of the need to build more roads, build more hospitals. And these I really see as big costs. But of course, there are benefits, and most of the benefits are not economic. Now, my accent probably gives away that I'm in favor of immigration. I will at this point say I'm not trying to pretend to be a turkey avoiding voting for Christmas. I have dual UK-Irish citizenship, so I'm safe. I am safe, I think. But, you know, I just really hope that people do see the gains that they hoped for, and that whatever price we pay is considered worth it. Because if that's the case, then this is exactly good democracy. This is exactly what democracy should be doing. I have some worries. And some of my worries are related to what Jagjit said. When talking about manufacturing, the decline of manufacturing in the UK is not related to the process of joining the European Union. The timing is coincidental, but it's due to this process of globalization. We have seen manufacturing move from the UK to Poland, to China. I spent the last year living in Asia. China is now losing manufacturing to Cambodia. This is what happens. The price of labor goes up and it moves on. This is a force which is very difficult to withhold. And now the talk is that freedom from the EU will allow us to sign more trade deals with exactly those countries who took the manufacturing from us. China, Indonesia, Philippines. These are the countries that are being spoken about. The other is immigration. Because what's very interesting is if you talk to people in Whitehall, the government officials, every government department wants its own exemption from the migration numbers. Department of Health will tell you, we can't run the health service without immigrants, so clearly we need them. But all the other immigrants should stay away. Department for Agriculture will tell you, UK agriculture cannot survive without migrant labour. My reference to raspberries was, raspberries are most likely picked in this country by foreigners. And if you don't have them, the price goes up. So we definitely need them. People in Treasury will tell you that the City of London relies on the expertise of people from you. So we need them to. And you go around all government departments, and it's all very not in my backyard type behaviour. And we all want the new restraint, but just not in my backyard. I want to go back to finish with the last point I said, and that is, for us as a profession, I think Brexit has been a very important soul-searching moment to try and think about how we communicate things. The biggest problem we face is everything we do is in an uncertain world. So when I said, I know I'll probably be wrong, and whenever we get precise about numbers, so whether it's the 2%, 4%, 6% costs that are mentioned, or on the other side, the 4% benefits that were mentioned, economists are basing these on lots of deep thinking, lots of knowledge, but they'll almost certainly be wrong because things change. My wife thinks my life is very sad, apart from being married to her. And she thinks that because I view the world as a series of uncertain things, but all things are possible. It's like being a football fan doesn't sit and go, the underdog is playing Manchester United. Bristol Rovers are playing Manchester United. We all know that the likelihood is that Bristol Rovers will win. No, I'm sorry, no. We all know the likelihood is that Man United will win, but there's a chance that something else happens. Economists live in this world where all things are possible, and so we can never say with certainty about what will happen, and we'll almost certainly be wrong. But we do base our thinking on lots of back knowledge and essentially good odds. And here I totally agree with everyone. While I don't think it will collapse, almost all economists, the 96%, believe that the economic costs of leaving the EU will be to the downside. There will be costs, not benefits. And that's why I really hope that if I'm going to be wrong as an economist, I'm wrong on that. I hope there are benefits. I don't think there will be. But I hope that everybody feels they get the benefits that are non-economic, that they felt were worth it when they went to the polling booth.
Thanks, Michael. And Paul?
Thank you. I'm not sure there's an enormous amount left to say, but I'll try anyway. So I think it's worth reflecting a little bit on the state of the economy, ignoring Brexit. So Brexit, I think, will be quite a big thing for the British economy, but 2008 and the crisis was probably, I hope, a bigger thing for the British economy. On June the 22nd last year, we had already had 8 years without growth. Essentially, income per head was the same as it was in 2008. We'd had 8 years without any growth in real earnings. People were earning the same 8 years later as they were in 2008. That is essentially unknown in British history. The Bank of England thinks the 1850s may have been similar. It's the 1850s. We had 7 years with essentially zero interest rates for the first time in the 320-year history of the Bank of England. We'd had productivity zero growth, in fact negative growth over that same period. So we'd had an awful 7 years before June the 22nd, 2016. And let me be frank, 7 years that we on the panel don't really fully understand, I don't think, in terms of exactly what drove that, and it's certainly exactly what we need to get out of it. So what we had was a set of economic circumstances which were inevitably going to make a bunch of people rather unhappy, quite understandably, but also a bunch of economic uncertainties on which we have layered another economic uncertainty, which is the long-run impact of coming out of the European Union. So what else can we tell from history? Well, we do know that these choices and these things that we do make a difference. They make a difference more in the long run than they make in the short run. Governments are very good at pretending that they are changing what the economy is doing this week or next week or last week. They can't really. And when they can, they normally create long-term problems. If the fact that wages are much lower than we'd like now is not George Osborne's fault, nor is it George Osborne's achievement that employment levels are really very high, much higher than we might reasonably have expected. Maybe he played a little bit of a role in each of those. But actually that's the combination of the effects of a whole series of things over 20 or 30 years. And let's go back a while. I just about remember the 1970s. I remember it probably better than I'd like. We were the sick man of Europe. I don't know, I mean, some in the audience I can tell remember the 1970s better than I do. Economically, we were way behind many other European countries. Our productivity performance over the previous 25 years had been appalling. Our income growth relative to France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and so on had been appalling. And that was not chance. That was because we had an appalling set of policies for a long period of time. Over the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, we actually did better than most other countries. Our productivity caught up to some extent. Our living standards rose, earnings rose, and that was to do with a better set of policies, including actually being part of the single market over that period. So the choices that we make have an effect, but they have an effect in the long run and not immediately. I think the effects of Brexit will be more like boiling the frog than slitting its throat. There is one short-run effect, though, which we do know, and that is that the currency is depreciated by about 20%. That will increase, that has increased inflation, and that just makes us worse off. A currency depreciation is just about making us worse off relative to the rest of the world. Let me finish by saying something about future challenges. Actually, a lot of the future challenges haven't changed very much. We know that we've got challenges in terms of what I was just talking about, earnings levels, productivity levels, and so on. And we do know some of the things that will make those better. We do know that more public investment will help. We do know that things like building roads will help. We do know that building more houses will help. There is a little secret in Whitehall. They do know how to make us better off. They just choose not to very often. Partly because people won't vote for them, because building a road or a house next to you isn't, or indeed a runway, isn't terribly popular. But we do know, we actually know that those things work, just as we know that free trade works. This is knowledge. This isn't just opinion or guesswork. We know that these things are good for growth. Those things still matter. Matters probably more than all of those, though, is the skills and education that we instill into the population. And we know that that matters. I'm less confident, actually, that we know how to do it right. We've been trying to do that for an awfully long time. But if there's one priority, there's that. But the last set of challenges, which I think will be made more difficult by all of this, is the long run challenges we face in terms of the public finances, particularly in the context of an aging population. We know we are already devoting more and more and more of public resources to health and pensions and social care than we have ever done in the past, and we will need to continue to do more of that in the future as the number of older people increases. Now that is a triumph of public social policy, but it's one that creates challenges. And those challenges mean that we will have to either raise more tax or spend less on other things or radically change the way that we deliver health and pensions. And why do I relate that to Brexit? Well, because if as a result of this we end up with significantly less immigration, then that problem becomes much greater, because nearly all of the immigrants from Europe were young and working and paying taxes to support the rest of us. So that challenge, if as seems likely, means that we have a lower population of working age, that challenge will only become greater. But irrespective of that, that seems to me the kind of big, difficult political and economic challenge and question we ought to be spending a lot of time thinking about and discussing and agreeing whether we want taxes to rise or spending on education and justice and so on to fall, or whether we want to do something very different to health, pensions and so on.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope you're feeling cheered up now. It's over to you. We have about 40 minutes for your comments and your questions. And I'm going to do that thing of taking them in batches of 3 and then coming back to somebody in the panel to pick up on those, whoever wants to. And tell us whatever's relevant about you, your name, if there's something relevant. Are you a student? Are you a foreign worker from the EU? Whatever it might be. But don't make long speeches, okay, because we want to get lots of people in. And there are some roving mics, so please wait for the mic to come and catch you up. And who would like to go first? Right at the back. There are 2 there. Thank you. I think they're running to get the mics first.
Good evening. My name is Robin Bolton. I'm retired. My question is quite simple. In the next 20 years, learning machines are reckoned to be able to take over all repetitive jobs, any job which needs a long-term memory for data. What if this will effectively require new skills? But the thing is, the thing about learning machines is they don't cost any money. You don't have to pay them any money. If you look at the example of, let's say, Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall, when the Roman Empire went over to slaves, their empire collapsed because nobody had any money to buy anything.
That's a great question. Not a small one to start us off. Thank you very much. And there was one behind you, in the middle there. Thank you.
So one of the groups in the UK that registered their dissatisfaction were people who were unskilled or had very low amounts of skills. We talked about the price of agricultural goods going up because we wouldn't have the workforce of Eastern Europeans coming over to fulfill those jobs. So I'm assuming that the price would go up because we'd need to pay people more. So surely that might be a benefit to those low-skilled people in the UK, that agricultural jobs would pay them more money in order to achieve the same output. So people could move into jobs rather than not having jobs because they'd pay more, and that might be a benefit to them.
Another great question. Is there a third one for this first batch? Yeah, one down the front here. This is a good game. I can make the people with the microphones run up and down stairs all evening. It's right down at the front here. Thanks.
Sorry, what?
It's here. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Yeah, Rupert Owen, economic development professional. My question is about the manufacturing sector, particularly the example that was used with the automotive sector. I understand the complexity of the supply chains that exist. The UK is also a big market for German, Italian, French manufactured goods.
in those sectors, surely some sort of trade agreement is going to be a given, and we're not going to go to the World Trade Organization default. That was it, really.
Three great questions to start with. Very high caliber audience, so well done. So Swati, I'm going to come to you for the one on the manufacturing supply chain.
Sure.
I'm going to come to Michael about productivity being driven up in sectors like agriculture. And who wants to do automation between Paul and Jagjit? You can, but I'm going to pick on somebody else as well. Paul, I'm looking at you. Okay. So Swati, you go first.
So in terms of what you're saying, this was essentially what was really promoted, that the UK essentially buys a lot from Germany in terms of cars, and that's why German car makers are the ones who are going to be essentially lobbying their governments that they get a good trade agreement with the UK. Let me remind you what the German Car Manufacturers Association chief Matthias Wismann said when he gave evidence in Parliament. He said that what was more important to them was essentially making sure that the European Union stays together, and the UK car industry, the UK car sales are much smaller for them compared to what they have at stake in the European Union. And this gets back to a sort of a broader question. What the UK exports to the EU is 13% of its GDP. What the EU exports to the UK is 3%. So in terms of just plain bargaining power, the EU has just much more bargaining power. There's more at stake in terms of jobs in this country than there is in the European Union. So it's very unlikely that they're going to that somehow the EU is going to be dying to give us a great trade deal. They're more concerned about ensuring that, in fact, getting out of the single market is less attractive than being a member of the single market. On the automation question, the only reason I jump in is because it's related to the car industry point as well, that a lot of what we heard was that globalization has essentially led to a decline in the manufacturing sector. That's absolutely true, but a lot of it also has to do, in fact, most economists would say that a major proportion of the decline of manufacturing should be attributed to automation and not so much to globalization. It's sort of, and why I'm bringing this up is because what's important for that is that we have the redistribution mechanisms in place so that when people lose their jobs, they have something else to fall back on. Just sort of putting up trade barriers to stem that kind of loss in manufacturing jobs is not the solution, because that's not going to be able to get rid of the problem which would arise over and over again due to automation.
So Paul, you were talking about the many challenges that the UK economy is going to face regardless of the extra challenge of Brexit. And surely automation is another one of those.
I don't know. I mean, I think this is an area where it's not just uncertain. We're not just facing a risk. We are just totally uncertain, actually, about where we're going to end up as a result of automation. Whether this will totally change the way that lorries are driven and the way that things are made, I don't know. And that's a different future depending on how those things play out. I mean, I would say two things. One is that the history of the last 200 years certainly is littered with huge technological change, and we learn two things from that. In the long run, those technological changes make us better off, and in the long run, the economy and the labour market and everything else adjust so that pretty much everyone is better off. But in the short run, and the short run can last for a decade or more, the people who are affected can be made a lot worse off. Just look particularly at what happened in the early 1980s, and we're only just, I think, seeing the end of the, or maybe not even the end, but the impact of that on individuals and communities was very long-lasting as industries closed down. So I think I would essentially agree with what Swati said, which is that we need to embrace, as it were, the change because it will make us better off, but we need to be much more effective and active than we were in the 1980s about providing support, whether that be training, whether that be income support, whether that be regional support to help those people and regions and communities who are badly affected in that kind of way. Can I just say one thing very quickly on the agricultural point and raspberries? I think the more likely outcome, and this may be the right outcome for the UK, is that we'll just stop growing raspberries. Now, if we decide we don't want people in the country to pick them, and there's an international market in raspberries, then rather than more jobs for British workers, there'll just be fewer jobs in Britain.
I can't resist saying I'm married to Rory Kethlen-Jones, the BBC's technology correspondent, so we have every gadget under the sun in the house, and I'm a little bit sceptical about automation. We have an Alexa, which sits next to the TV, and we were watching University Challenge, calling out the answers, as you do, when all of a sudden Alexa piped up, I don't know the answer to that question. So she'd been listening to the TV, but she can't do the ironing. So, Michael, Paul already spoke about the raspberries, but what about this other point that this might just be a shock that forces an upskilling of the labour force and higher productivity and wages?
So I have written down almost exactly what Paul said. Again, I in some way, I would hope that you're right, but actually, most of the evidence, and it's not just about raspberries, it's about a lot of sectors in the UK that rely on immigrant labour. Either people have been unwilling to work at the levels that make it profitable for the companies, or there's a long time lag. So, for instance, in the NHS, one of the big concerns is you can't magic nurses and doctors very quickly. It takes a long time to train them. And the UK at the moment is a net importer of medical professionals. So I would like to think that wages go up and we all adjust to paying more for our raspberries. The reality is we go up to paying more for our raspberries because they come from abroad, and we just produce none in this country at all. So that's the bigger worry. Since he encroached on my question, I'm going to encroach on his. And that is to tell the story. It's not so well known. The term Luddite is used to describe people who resist new technologies, and it's used as a sort of negative or pejorative term, like "Aren't you so short-sighted?" Clearly, the spinning loom was going to improve everybody in the long run, and so you shouldn't reject its adoption. It's less well known that for about 15 or 20 years, the people who were the Luddites had a much worse standard of living as a result of the introduction of the new technology. So resisting may be bad for some kind of longer-term view for the economy, but there are definitely distributional impacts of these technologies. And I fully agree with what Paul said. I think we may have to go back and think a lot more radically about how we view work, life, the role of the state in a world in which there is more technology of this sort. So having resisted even thinking about it for a long time, I'm increasingly trying to think about ways of making things like universal basic income, which you don't like, and that's fine, or a system whereby we've seen over years, we've seen an growing share of the sort of profits of the UK production going as profits rather than as wages. So do we move to a system where there are shares essentially made more easily available to people to take advantage of this? Do we have to change our views on what it means for people not to work? It's actually very, I don't want to get wonkish and technical, but in the economic models that we all write down, people are assumed to balance between working and leisure is a good thing. In fact, we only work so that we can consume in our leisure time, and yet we sort of don't necessarily view people who work less hours or have more flex in the same way. This sort of laziness view. So I think there are more radical things that we need to be thinking about, but it's a very difficult problem and very uncertain.
Right, let's go for the next round of questions. So there's a hand right at the back there, and then in the middle, and then a lady at the front here. Lots of hands. We'll have time for a lot more of you. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Stuart Newman. I'm an economist at the Office of National Statistics. I'm interested in government debt. So the rate on government debt, it has been low for quite some time. It seems like that's going to continue whilst there are few alternatives. I wonder what the panel think could be a trigger to the markets turning around and actually demanding more from the government in terms of the interest on debt.
Okay, thank you. Now there's one in the middle. Put your hand up again, right here. Thank you.
Hello, Pete Dorr, former governor, University of the West of England. I wonder if I could cast people's minds back to 2003 and a really obscure Bank of England report, Housing and EMU, which pointed out the really unusual relationship between people's perceptions of equity in the housing market and their consumer spending and willingness to take on debt, and asked the panellists what they view the interaction of Brexit and the UK housing market as either an opportunity or a threat.
Okay, thank you. And then a lady at the front here.
My name is Imogen. I was just going to ask, I'd read an article about taxing machines. So if you have less people working for a company, then the company would actually, the people power wouldn't be a problem. It would just be the companies would have to pay a tax on every machine that's doing a person's job.
So we're ranging quite widely in this batch of questions. Thank you. Jagjit, let me come to you about the interest rate on government debt.
So interest rates on government debt are about as low as they've ever been. The government can sell 50-year paper at a fraction over 1%, which were numbers that we never thought were going to be possible in the past. And so the question is, what might trigger a change in that? The current level of net debt to GDP is about 90%, which is high by peacetime standards. We've been higher than there before, but that was mostly associated with wartime, so the French Revolutionary, Napoleonic Wars, World War I and World War II all led to radical increases in debt above those kinds of numbers, but the increases we've seen recently are the largest in peacetime. And even that level of debt, a third of it has had to be bought back by the Bank of England. Otherwise, we're not quite sure what the interest rate would be. We don't really know what the interest rate would be in the absence of the bank holding some 30% of it. So the question, in a sense, was how long can this last, and what might trigger interest rates rising even more? And one of the things that surprises me is that we don't understand some of the things we've been talking about today well enough. If we crank forward current levels of expenditure on the old and social care, and look at the demographics of the country and crank that forward, we're going to get debt levels to GDP in the UK. This is an Office of Budgetary Responsibility report from January of around 250% by 2060, which is as high as it's ever been in the UK. And if that's in expectation, given current policies and current demographics, that's a very worrying number indeed. And it's a kind of wonder we're holding any debt at all if that's the expectation. I think it's a great concern, actually, where interest rates for debt may go, particularly if the bank wants to reverse its holding of QE, and or if interest rates start to regularise, we might find very quickly the government in trouble in terms of financing its own debt levels. But then we go back to what we're doing with what we're borrowing. There's a big difference between borrowing to spend on transfers and borrowing to invest in infrastructure. And as has been pointed out by everyone on this panel so far, it's very hard to find bits of infrastructure you can invest in because everyone seems to complain. Nobody wants a hospital or road next door to them. They certainly don't want airports anywhere near them, but the country as a whole needs them. So I'm not quite sure how we square these things up. So I think it's one of the biggest problems facing the UK. Very briefly, I just want to say something about the housing market. The net worth of the household sector over the last 20 years has increased by about 11% a year. So that's if you take the assets held minus the liabilities, which is mostly loans on mortgages. The net worth has increased markedly, but it's a large fraction of it, 50% or more, is held in housing. So it's very hard to recycle that back into the real economy if it's stuck in bricks and mortar. If it was in other forms, equity, or other forms of savings, it's something banks can use to recirculate back into the economy. But instead, as a country, we tend to want to save in our housing stock, which tends to also lead to greater problems in terms of wealth inequality over time as well, because under a world of low interest rates that we've just been talking about, those asset prices in housing go up very markedly, making it very hard for those of us starting out in life to make a start and get on that ladder to build up their net worth. So I think there's some very serious problems, not made any easier by having, as Paul and Michael and Swati are saying, all our policymakers tied up in trying to make some kind of trade agreement with the European Union. I'd rather they were thinking about these problems.
So you answered two questions, and I think both underline the sort of extraordinary times that we're in anyway, and Brexit comes on top of that. Michael, you started us on the radical path of universal basic income. Do you want to tax robots too?
Well, I'm not a robot, so I'm happy to tax them. Yeah. I came to a talk. I organised and sat in the audience of a talk like this very recently by a guy who works for the Economist newspaper. We all call it a magazine, but they're very strict that it's a newspaper and it should be called a newspaper. So I will do that. And he's written a book called The Wealth of Humans, essentially outlining the potential challenges of this. And exactly as people were asking earlier, the idea that we will potentially be relying on machines for delivering more and more aspects of our daily life, notwithstanding your concerns about technology that does not know the answer or whatever. And I don't know if it's specifically taxing the robots that is the only answer. I certainly know that there are still some things that humans can do that robots cannot, and increasingly, I guess the question we'll all have to ask ourselves is, as we get older and older and we need more and more healthcare, how happy are we to have our massage bot come in and do our physiotherapy for us, as opposed to paying a professional to do that? How happy will we be to not ever go see a doctor or talk to a doctor, but simply enter our ailments into a sort of Google doctor and have the prescription printed out and then have an Amazon drone drop it at our front door a few minutes later? Well, I mean, we laugh. I remember when someone told me about wireless internet. I thought, that's crazy. and now I get upset if I'm on a train and I happen to be going through the countryside and I don't happen to have technology to catch Sky Sports live with full high definition quality. I mean, our perceptions of these things can change very quickly. So it may be that we tax more heavily capital or the profits of these firms. It may be that we all encourage our children to become, robot wars, which was always seen as a very geeky thing for children to watch on TV. Maybe actually it's exactly what we should be pushing our kids towards. But again, it goes to this bigger question of, I think even before that, what are the policies that the government can encourage in terms of skills and education that are not going to pay off in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but are going to pay off in 20, 30 years' time. And I think that's a much bigger policy challenge. And again, I go back to what a few of us have said. I mean, to me, these are the policy challenges that I would really like a lot of very clever civil servants to be thinking about, rather than trying to untangle the wires.
Meanwhile, if you're worried about your own job being automated, there's a calculator on the Financial Times website that allows you to work out. And the good news is that economics professors are among the least likely jobs to be automated in the near future. So there were lots of hands up. Another round of questions. One right here, thank you. And then I'll come to the middle, and then I'll go to the back.
Hello, I'm Arthur. I'm from Germany. I'm a student. I would like to hang on to the question about debt and maybe ask you about the likelihood of the UK becoming a tax haven, because that is something our finance minister in Germany is quite worried about.
Okay, good question. It was in the middle here, thank you. Can you pass it down the row?
Hello, my name's Luke and I'm an engineer in the civil service. My question is that the consensus is that the economy will be worse off, at least in the small to medium term. But what do you think will happen between the gap between the social classes, taking into consideration workers' rights, human rights, and red tape that SMEs get tied up in, or it's spoken about that they get tied up in?
Thank you very much. And then there was somebody towards the back. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name's Ashley. I just want to come back to one of the causes of Brexit, which I think is we've had 8 years of stagnant or really no growth. And I think one of the worries that people have is this is going to be a permanent fixture of our economy. We're going to move into a no or low growth environment. What does the panel think has caused this, and what can we do to get out of it?
Great. Swati, how about the tax haven question? Do you fancy tackling that one?
That's the hardest one to answer. So we don't know if there's in fact going to be reductions in corporate taxes. There was a suggestion, of course, by Theresa May about it. I think the broader point here is that if that is the path we're going down on, and there's some indications that that is going to happen, which is what happened with the Nissan deal that was done behind the scenes. We have no idea whether there was actually any aid promised to Nissan, or was it just simply about getting electric cars, car plugs in. The broader point here is that currently labor is taxed differently from capital, and this sort of situation is just going to amplify that kind of dichotomy even further. At the moment, we don't have a choice as workers to decide where we choose to be taxed. We don't have a right to sort of choose which band we fall in, where to put what amount of income. And all of those issues are going to become even more difficult when the UK exits the European Union, because a lot of the various regulations that guarantee certain worker rights, etc., are through the European Union. So we have to re-legislate that. Thankfully, there is Theresa May in her white paper did mention that working time directives would be kept in place, but there are many other issues which are really sort of being swept under the rug, which is what happens to things like investment agreements. So the investment dispute settlement mechanism, which is what the US typically pushes for when it does a trade agreement with any country, that's essentially what's going to be pushed with the UK also. So in that sense, workers' rights are going to become even more compromised after something like a Brexit.
Paul, you're best placed, I think, to talk about inequality and distribution issues, perhaps linked to what does it look like if the economy stays stagnant for a long time?
Yeah. Again, I don't. So let's look at what's happened and then think about what might happen. I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding in some senses about what has happened to inequality. The key thing that's happened over the last 7 years has been the stagnation, as you say, in incomes right across the board. If we look back over the last 40 years, what's happened essentially to income inequality is there was a massive increase in income inequality in the 1980s, historically unprecedented increase, and that meant that the very rich got richer than the quite rich, who got richer than the middling, who got richer than the middling poor, who got richer than the poor. So it's an increase in distribution in inequality right across. Actually, since 1990, so for the last 25 years, in terms of income inequality, it hasn't shifted. Income inequality is the same now as it was in 1990, with one exception. Now, that exception is the top 1%, who over the period up to 2008 pulled further and further and further and further and further away from everyone else. So actually, as I said, in the 1980s, everyone got more unequal. From 1990, the top 1% pulled away from everyone else, but everyone else the distribution between them stayed much the same. Now, partly, that was actually a very specific result of policy in the 2000s. So £30 billion increase in spending on tax credits did a great deal to keep inequality down at the bottom bit of the distribution. So what's happened since 2008 is that actually right across the piece, inequality has fallen a bit, but it has fallen right across the piece. And indeed, since 2008, the top 1% appear to have stopped running away in terms of their incomes. But the other thing that's happened in terms of inequality over the last 10 or 20 years is that there's a very big shift in the distribution between generations. So if you look back to the 1970s, the early 1980s, to be old was pretty much synonymous with being poor. That's completely reversed. Something astonishing happened in 2011, and that is the average income, not the wealth, the average income of people over state pension age rose above that of people under state pension age for the first time in history. And the wealth, obviously, has very, very much more focused in that group. If you look forward in terms of what might be the impact of Brexit on all of that, I think there are a number of things are possible. One is that because the economy is doing less well, we'll have lower interest rates for even longer, and that will concentrate wealth even more among the older generation. I think that's one possibility. Another possibility is that because the economy is doing less well, who always suffers when the economy is doing less well, those on the lowest wages and the youngest, those in their 20s. And they're the group who certainly those in their 20s did much the worst since 2008 in terms of their income. So if there is an impact on the economy, it tends to be those groups who do least well.
And is that linked to the tax point, Paul, that if it's becoming harder and harder to tax capital, or we want to go down the tax haven route, then that just gets reinforced?
Yeah, I don't know that we're so are we going to go down a tax haven route? We've already got the lowest corporation tax rate outside of Ireland in the top 28 or 30 countries in the world. So we've already got a very low rate of corporation tax, though we've actually got quite a broad base. So in terms of the amount of corporation tax a lot of companies pay, it's not so much less here than it is elsewhere. In terms of raising more, we are going to need to raise at least as much revenue as we're raising at the moment going forward. Where are we going to get that from? We've already seen that it's remarkably difficult to raise any tax following the unravelling of the budget of a month ago, which is a very modest change in a tax rate on a group who are taxed a lot less than we are, because we're employees. And so if you're self-employed or incorporated, you just pay a lot less tax for the same amount of income, and the economy is moving in that direction. So that's a real problem for the tax base. What I think is right is that we're not going to be able to get a lot more money from capital. I don't think we're going to be able to tax robots at all, for all sorts of reasons, but one of the reasons that we're not going to be able to is you can move a robot to another country very much more easily than you can move a worker. So I think the impact of tax changes will be on, well, all tax changes affect people, but I think it's more likely to be directly on people rather than indirect.
Let's just have a show of hands. I know you're not a nationally representative audience, but who would put up your hand if you would pay an extra 1 or 2 pence income tax if it was earmarked for the NHS? Yeah, you're not a representative audience, but that is almost everybody here. Okay, another batch of questions.
There was one we didn't answer.
Oh, sorry, Michael.
Which I think Jag should answer.
You tell him what it is and he'll answer it.
It was the question. It's the question to explain why we've had 8 years of essentially no growth. I think that was the question that came up, but had been ignored, and I didn't want to answer it, but I wanted him to answer it.
Okay. Go on.
Well, as he did me a favour earlier in the day, I won't say no. Thank you, Michael, for that. Is that called a hospital pass?
That is.
Yeah, that's right. So when we try to think about what's happening in the economy, what matters is essentially income per head, or income per labour unit employed. And as we said, that's moved sideways over the last few years, and that's because we haven't managed to increase the amount of capital we've employed per worker who's in a job. And this is a result of a number of things. Firms have tended to hoard labour, which has been relatively cheap, and haven't invested. I've talked about that a little bit earlier on. They've just managed to... just wait for that phone to... Is it important?
It's probably Siri telling me to keep an eye on the time.
That's right. So firms haven't invested. That means the level of capital employed per worker hasn't increased over this period. And that's the best way to think about productivity. There's just not a lot of capital available for every worker who's currently in a job. It could also just be the way the financial sector hasn't reallocated capital to new, younger firms with productive new ideas. The period of forbearance we've had over the last 7 or 8 years has meant that capital has been stuck with old firms, with old ideas who haven't brought in new ways of doing things better. And therefore it hasn't been recycled by extracting it from those firms in a natural process of decay. All the time, firms are falling down and their capital is being re-employed and given to new firms. That process has almost been frozen in the last 10 years. So because that capital hasn't been recycled to new firms, you haven't been able to get to new levels of productivity. And it's a particular feature of financial crises. So these things have come together in this way. And I think that's the biggest problem we face.
Can I add?
Yeah.
I'll take the pass back just at the end. And I would just say, it's very difficult because exactly as Jag is saying, if banks are not lending and firms are not investing, we sort of face that challenge that he lays out. And at the same time, the solution of let's get the banks to lend more is very difficult, because actually one of the reasons they're not lending as much is they are now under quite serious pressure from the prudential regulators, the Bank of England, to ensure they don't take as much risk as they took in the run-up to the financial crisis. So this is something which I'm sure everybody sitting up here is aware of. There's a lot of work that has looked at financial crises, recessions after financial crises, and across the world, across time, they tend to last at least twice as long. The recovery takes at least twice as long after a financial crisis than after another type of recession. So in other words, there is something about the reliance of our financial system to get savings to investors, into companies that we need to get the engine of growth going again. And when that ceases to work after a financial crisis, things take a lot longer. And that, I think, is certainly part of the answer to your question.
Actually, just to pass the ball back. Yeah. So in fact, it's connected with housing as well, because when we look at lending, by far and away, the people who banks lend to are people who own property and against property. It's mostly mortgage-based lending, which we don't lend directly to firms with ideas or provide venture capital for firms at all. If you need to get a loan, you need to place your property on the line. And that, of course, is a further form of inequity, in a sense in which exactly the regulations that Michael was talking about are going to hit the kind of people who are already against their borrowing constraint. It's not going to hit people with masses of equity available to them. So the loans themselves are now distributed in a manner that is, at least if not increasing measurable inequality, is affecting what Amartya Sen calls capability. People's capability to do things is constrained by the regulations that are in place. And that seems to me a much bigger problem than measuring things like Gini coefficients, which, of course, as Paul rightly says, in the UK have been mostly stable in the last 35 years. But people's notions of what they're able to do seems to me to be constrained.
Time for another round. Lady right at the front here caught my eye first, and then in front of her. So we'll take two here. We'll stay at the front. We'll come to you afterwards.
Okay. Hi, Vicky Wass. I'm an economist working in a business school. Paul Mason, about a year ago, in terms of the economic ideas, came to talk in Bristol, and he made the point that the stimulus to investment was that labour was expensive and regulated, and the problem for Britain was the weakness of labour. And we haven't really talked about that at all tonight. And there was a programme on Radio 4 about productivity in France being much higher than in Britain, partly because the French labour market was so highly regulated. And to kind of link it back into what Paul Johnson was saying about one of the headwinds being demographic change, with the retirement of the baby boomers, might that change when there's not so many people available competing for jobs in the labour market?
Okay, right behind you.
I don't know whether my perception is correct, but in this country we don't seem to invest so much in companies as trade in them. There seem to be an awful lot of companies that are sold abroad, and we're not investing in new setup companies very much. And also the business of the zero contract hour jobs, which to me do not seem like proper jobs, in as much that the income is unreliable, therefore the tax stemming from these jobs is almost non-existent, and people who have these sorts of jobs with 0 hours contract cannot really invest in their own futures because they cannot borrow money.
Thank you very much, and right in front of you.
You mentioned corporation tax rates in Ireland briefly. Many huge American corporations seem to be registered in Ireland with access to a single market, including Facebook, Google, and I believe Apple have a sweetheart deal, so to speak, of 2% corporation tax in Ireland, obviously with access to sell to UK, Germany, and so forth. Is Brexit an opportunity to tackle that tax avoidance?
So, Swati and Jagjit, I'd like you two to tackle the questions about can you use labour costs as a driver to improve productivity, and what are we going to do about conditions in the labour market? Give you a moment to think about that. And you two can talk about the Irish tax sweetheart deal. I'm looking at you, Michael.
Somehow thought that might come my way. I don't know why. Okay, so I'll say a few things. So Ireland has always been, by always I mean in my lifetime, so not that long. But
it's more years than you might think.
It was, I mean, when I was born in Ireland, Ireland was a poor country. It was a poor country in Europe. By the time I left Ireland and I was working in the Bank of England in 2001 to 2002, Ireland, in per capita terms, became richer than the UK. This was a huge turnaround for a formerly poor country on the periphery of Europe. And one part of that has been an unashamed desire to use its educated workforce, its English language, and its low taxes to attract corporations. So it's absolutely true that Facebook and Google have big operations in Ireland and locate a lot of profit there. But it's also true that they employ a lot of people there. If you go to just north of the very centre of Dublin, just north of Pearse Street Station, sorry, just south of Pearse Street Station, you will find the new Google headquarters, European headquarters. In total, they employ about 3,000 people in Ireland, most of them high-skilled. In addition to that, there are a number of business services that now exist in the area to service the Facebooks and Googles. It's not just technology, actually. If you look up in the sky and you see a commercial airline, there is about a 50% chance that the airline that you see is registered in Ireland. That airline may never have been in Ireland. This is true if you are in Greece looking at a flight that's going to Israel. That plane is almost certainly owned and operated officially out of Ireland. Ireland has built up a series of industries, so high-tech, airline leasing, pharmaceuticals, where it has done that in order to build up this highly educated sort of workforce and industries that are operating there. But one thing I want to mention about the Irish case, which a lot of people forget, is about 20 years even before any of this, the Irish changed their education system to invest in free education all the way through, improve the teacher training. Again, a longer-term investment which started to come good. So now I'll actually answer your question, having defended Ireland for a little bit. Is Brexit an opportunity for the UK to change their views on corporate tax avoidance, as you describe it? Why do we need to refer to Brexit? There's absolutely nothing stopping HMT from doing any of these changes while a member of the European Union. The one thing that you cannot do, which potentially could change, and maybe people will ask questions about this, but the one thing you cannot do as a member of the EU is provide state aid to a given industry. So in Ireland, they used to have a 10% tax only on manufacturing, and it led to a number of funny things where Fife's bananas, of course Colombian bananas, came into Europe, into Ireland, and they had those little stickers that you get on bananas put on them in Ireland and taken out of the big boxes and put into small boxes. And they fought a case in the Irish courts to be classified as a manufacturing industry, to get a 10% tax. And the Irish reacted to European regulations on this by saying, fine, everybody pays 10% tax. There is nothing stopping the UK from addressing that as a member of the EU. They chose not to.
So we're running out of time, so let's come to Swati and Jagjit about labour costs, labour conditions, using that as a lever to get to a higher skill, higher productivity.
So I think this argument has been made several times, and the NSC has at least 2 years of Growth Commission reports saying that investment in skills, investment in R&D, investment in infrastructure is about the only way that you can really do this in a constructive fashion. In terms of sort of what Brexit would do to it, I think it's more likely that Brexit would undermine worker rights further for precisely some of the reasons that I mentioned. Some of the guarantees have been given. Yes, workers will still get 21 days of paid leave. And yes, some of those issues of zero-hour contracts are something which are domestic issues, and that those can be resolved irrespective of Brexit. But more generally, if we're going to embark on a sort of strategy where there are low corporate taxes, primarily to attract investment from Ireland and shift them to the UK or from the Virgin Islands or wherever, or if it's to do with us signing deals with the US, with sort of these big countries like China, India, we are going to be compromising on worker rights. India is going to want migration restrictions eased for its own citizens, and this is going to be mostly technical professionals. And China is going to want manufacturing tariffs reduced further. The US is going to want the investment state dispute settlement mechanism, which I was talking about, where firms are allowed to directly sue or challenge government policies. Those are levers that are not available to workers, and that's precisely what's at stake. And I'm going to come back to two questions that came up earlier. One is this issue of Luddites. Yes, the Luddites had worse standards of living later, but the Luddites were also doing one more thing, which was they were trying to bring it to the attention of people that workers' rights were being undermined when automation was happening. And I think that part of the story is usually forgotten. And the way people in ancient Rome responded to that was precisely by having redistribution mechanisms in place, whether that was guaranteeing people some amount of land or whether that was through agriculture in those days. Those are the sorts of mechanisms we should be focusing on now.
So we're coming to that very sad moment when we have to stop because we're running out of time. It's been a great conversation, and you can carry on tomorrow, where the public event is Reskilling the UK, 6 o'clock to 7:15, here again, another free event. So do please come back. You'll get a different brains trust tomorrow evening, but it will be just as good a conversation. So one person can ask the last question, and then everybody in the panel gets one sentence each to reply to it. And the gentleman in the blue jumper in the middle put his hand up fast enough that he gets to ask the last question. So hold your hand up again so they can see you. And I get to make the microphone holder run down the stairs again.
And hurdle.
Thank you. I'm Luke. I work in commercial law, and primarily I work with banks and financial institutions. And one of the things in that sector that has been particularly discussed and has been a source of some concern is this issue around corporate passporting, whereby corporate entities in the UK are able to operate within the EU. I wonder if you might be able to comment on A, whether you think corporate passporting is likely to continue, and B, if it doesn't, what the impact on the UK economy, both in terms of City and London, but more broadly the UK economy might be as our economy has shifted towards this specialist area of finance.
Thanks very much. A good one to end with. You guys get one sentence each, and that's all. Swati.
It's unlikely. The city's already given up trying to get at that, and that's why they're moving over to equivalence. But can we stop talking about just the financial services industry? That's 8% of GDP, 13% of GDP is what governments buy from each other, and those are big changes that are going to come after Brexit.
Judicious use of and but to keep that to one sentence. Jagjit.
I'm more concerned about the financial sector. It's something we do very well compared to the rest of the world in a world of comparative advantage. We'd want it to continue, but where we'll end up with the European Union is a very big question, too big for me to answer today.
Michael.
No, comma. No, I don't think it will be. I mean, Swati's right. Passporting is sort of off the table now. There's no way the European regulators will allow the UK to continue in its privileged position whereby it is not part of the euro, but most of euro transactions take place in London. They've been trying to stop it for a while. Germany, Ireland, Netherlands, Paris are all trying to get their piece of the pie. We can say goodbye to that part.
I think you had some semicolons in there.
Semicolons, many of them.
Well, I'm glad we got on to services right at the end. I mean, we spent a bit of time at the beginning talking about cars and so on. Of course, the UK is a dramatically service-based economy, and the deal we come to on services is going to be absolutely crucial. And that's not about tariffs, essentially. That is about the right to continue working with and in and trading with the rest of Europe. And that's going to get more difficult, whatever agreement we come to. And there seem to be two choices, both of which are clearly worse than where we are at the moment. One is we continue to have full or close to full rights, possibly because we essentially import all of the laws that affect the services industries into the UK so that we are fully recognised as if we were still in the EU, but then we get no say over them. Or we don't do that, in which case it becomes much more difficult to do the trade, but we do have control here. And it's this kind of strange dilemma between control on the one hand and how well off we are on the other. And the problem is that we've we've just said no to the middle route, which is where we've got some control, but also we gain in terms of our incomes.
So I think the message you take home this evening is it's a choice. No, it's not a choice, but we're boiling the frog and not slitting its throat. Is that right? Have I got that right? It's been a great debate. Thank you so much. Please come back tomorrow and continue 6 o'clock to 7:15. And please join me in thanking our panel who've been brilliant.